Whether it's hitting the gym or building a diet plan, you do a lot to ensure your own health and livelihood. How can you do the same for your data? Chris Mohr, president of the Software and Information Industry Society, explains how the policies behind AI's development significantly affect the industry's day to day operations, right here on Future Proof.
The future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed. Yet. Today's world teems with innovation. The nexus of hardware, software, and human ingenuity promises a revolution in possibilities. What does tomorrow look like? Witness Future Proof.
Yours truly, Eric Cavanaugh here. And folks, I'm very excited to be dialed into our nation's capital. We're going to talk to an industry visionary today. We've got Mr. Chris Mohr on the line from the Software and Information Industry Association, or SIIA. We're going to talk all about data and the data life cycle and protecting the data life cycle and frankly, being responsible stewards of data. And that's good for lots of different reasons, one of which happens to be this explosion of artificial intelligence. So it's not just people using data and people processing data. No, there are machines that are using data to train on and to do all sorts of different things. And that is very, very disruptive. And I think it's going to continue to be disruptive. So we want to talk also about responsible AI and how to get there. And the short answer is a lot of it has to do with data. And with that, let me welcome Chris Mohr to the show. Thanks for your time today. Tell us a bit about yourself and about the SIIA.
Sure, my pleasure. It's good to be with you, and thank you for the invite.
Yeah, you bet.
We are, what we like to say is we're a place for folks who are in the business of information. And what we do is we look to preserve and protect a healthy information life cycle. In other words, we want to make sure that there is a good environment for its creation, dissemination, and productive use. Mm-hmm. And our members range from platform companies that you're probably familiar with, as well as educational publishers, news organizations and database publishers, and financial data firms.
Okay, and you get into a lot of different policy areas, obviously. I mean, there's intellectual property, there's privacy, there's cybersecurity, and just the use of data. So when you talk about the data life cycle, I presume you're talking about data from its creation to its grave, basically, from its
That's right.
inception through its use all the way to its deprecation, which in many cases doesn't even happen because it just sits around forever. But in a lot of cases, companies will follow process and procedure, and after X period of years, whatever the regulation is, they will delete that data and move on. Can you talk about how that works? I mean, you are an association, so you have leaders from many of these big companies, I guess over 800 members, who come together to forums and really talk about this stuff and kind of hash out what to do. Because I know from experience, policy is hard, and policies need to be understandable, they need to be known, and they need to be reasonable in order for people to follow them. So tell us a bit about how you go about doing that and maybe give us some examples.
Sure. I mean, I think there are areas, for example, where there's a pretty good bit of consensus within our membership, which is the easiest place to take policy positions. And so, for example, let's talk about privacy. That's right. That's a hot topic. And is there an AI wrinkle? Absolutely, there is. But that's an area where we saw a bunch of, we saw state laws coming from California in their signature law. And we looked at the text and we saw, okay, looking at it from the standpoint of a United States model, which it was likely to be initially, this has a real First Amendment problem. And the way that Europe approached GDPR and the way that we as the United States approach the use of information are very, very different. Mm-hmm. And so there we looked at that and we said, look, we want there to be a privacy law. We're not opposing the idea that you pass a privacy law. but you need to carve out publicly available information, because if you don't, the whole thing will go down in flames.
Right.
Right. And so we successfully, on behalf of our members, and they were, uniformly, I think, behind this, advocated for language in that, first in the CCPA and then in the ballot initiative, that carves out the use of publicly available data. So you can't tell for somebody who publishes, for example, a database of news articles to stop selling information about you or to delete information about you, which under GDPR is, theoretically can happen. And certainly in the business-to-business publishing space, which is another division of ours, that kind of thing is really important.
Yeah. Well, and I remember when GDPR came out and they had this whole thing. I think you might like this. They had this whole thing about the right to be forgotten, which is where they're saying that if you're an EU citizen and you want some corporation to delete whatever data it has about you, that you have a right to do that, and the corporation has to follow through and go ahead and delete your data. Well, as soon as I heard that, I was like, good luck with that one. First of all, data about someone in a company gets lots of places. It could be in this database, it could be in that database, it could be in email exchanges between people. There are lots of places where that data can live. And quite frankly, in many organizations, there aren't too many people who know all the places where that data can live. And it's hard to query your entire information landscape. I mean, these days, just this morning, I did a call with Justin Borgman, who's the CEO and co-founder of a company called Starburst. And they do federated queries, like on a data lake, basically, where they can query all sorts of different systems, all sorts of different databases through one abstraction layer. And that's very cool. And it's also very new, right? So, and not every company has Starburst or Dremio or these kind of tools. So point being, it puts a tremendous onus on the organizations to be able to do all that. Besides which, it's very difficult to know. Is this the John Brown who lives at 101 Main Street or the John Brown who lives at 401 First Street or something? Like, just knowing identity resolution is a challenge in and of itself. So my point is, GDPR, pretty onerous stuff. I mean, I understand it's not always prosecuted. So the idea is to have these sort of goals to strive toward. But there's something else I want to throw out and maybe just get your take on all this stuff. I came up with this concept. I call it the right to be respected. And what that means is I want anyone who's using my data to respect my data and to respect my preferences. So if you ask me how do I want to be contacted, I say by email, not by phone. I would like for your operational system to reflect that and for people to not call me and instead to email me, right? That requires an architecture with policies that are baked in and adhered to. But I think that's a more reasonable approach, is to say to the XYZ organizations, yes, of course you need my data when I buy things or if I sign up for stuff. That's all fine, but just, be a careful and responsible steward of our information and have some policy around that makes sense. But what do you think about all that?
I mean, to me, that sounds very sensible. And I think, the question that where it becomes sticky, I think, is depending on who you talk to, the idea, the word respected carries a lot of weight. Right. That does a lot of work. And so, for some people, respecting data meant, the second that I have finished conducting business with your organization, I want you to take all my data, put it on a hard drive, smash it into bits and throw it in the sea. So I know that it's gone. That's probably not terribly practical. Right. And, other folks may say, that's generally not how our, well, not generally, it's not how our members roll, but they won't say, well, we respected you enough to get the data from you by consent in the first place.
Right.
Are we done here? That's not, that's not practical either. And look, nobody wants to get spammed with tons of messages from a company that they just did business with once, or God forbid, called.
Right.
And I think there are some natural market checks on that stuff.
And that's an excellent point, right? Is that the companies that do respect your privacy, that do respect your data and you as a person, well, they're going to have a good brand. They're going to have a good reputation. And that's where you let the market guide things But to your point, you do need some kind of policy. And I think the good news is that the technologies we have today enable robust policy management. 10 years ago or 20 years ago, all you could really do is govern access at the database level or at the application layer, for example, through a login or something like that. But now you really can't have policies that are baked into cloud-based systems that are usually role-based. If this person is an accountant, they have access to accounting data. If they're a senior executive, they have access to a lot of different data. All those kind of things are possible today, and that makes the process of policy design and implementation and enforcement a whole heck of a lot easier, right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think, and that's something even as a small organization, we have, where there are people, there are people who need to have the keys to everything,
Right.
but there ain't many of them,
Right.
right?
That's right.
And there are folks who need to be able to access Microsoft Office, and that's essentially about it.
Right.
And it's really important internally. I think technology's come a long way to allowing internal companies to exercise those controls, as well as, I mean, in terms of what our members do, even when they're dealing with customers, there will be a range of controls on what a particular customer might be able to do with what they access, and how that's determined. So that could be everything from refs and warranties in a contract, in a terms of use, in the subscription agreement, to IP monitoring and clearance, to sometimes even site visits, to be sure that this place that is licensing access to information is, in fact exists.
Right.
And is not some, it depends. They adopt a risk-based approach to all of this stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you make another good point about having the need for people who understand how the systems work, right? If something is a black box, well, it's kind of hard to understand a black box. And now, I mean, at the risk of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here, artificial intelligence, large language models, right? These companies that built some of the first ones like OpenAI, for example. I know a lot of people who know about that whole process, and what I'm told is that early in the game, they realized they cannot just set these engines loose on the internet at large, because there's a lot of nonsense on the internet. There's a lot of true stuff, and there's a lot of stuff that's not true. There's speculation, there's sarcasm, there are all kind of things. And so they had to be very careful about how they train the models, but they clearly train the models on a corpus of data on the internet. And so, like, where do you run into, how do you even delineate copyright on something like that? And what's fun is if you ever ask ChatGPT or Gemini, which is what I use, about copyright, it'll give you a pretty thoughtful answer. It'll say, well, actually, you might want to talk to your attorney or something like that. But what are your high level thoughts about that? I realize it's a very sensitive subject, but I'm sure you guys are talking about that, right?
We do. And this is this is an area, I had mentioned there are areas where our members agree. And this is an area where they don't. But there are a few points, and I'm a recovering copyright lawyer, and so perfectly happy to have a relapse. But just so you know,
you've been there.
I've been there. So there are definitely two sides to this story, and on the one side, you have a technology that, at its core, is looking for statistical relationships between words and series of words.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, right? That's what it's interested in.
Right.
So a word, quick, brown, the next likely word is fox, is a lot more likely than rutabaga, and it's a physics model of sorts.
Right.
For language.
Right.
And so in determining those relationships, you are abstracting out a particular non-fact, if you like. And the argument on the one side would point to reverse engineering cases that have held that type of activity to be lawful.
Right.
That's one piece of it. The other piece of it is that On the one hand, the work may be copied. The work was copied. There's no doubt about that. It is being used to create works that may not be literally similar, but are nonetheless competitively substitutive for the works of the originating authors.
Right.
That's an issue. And there may be issues, there may be other issues in there around the weights assigned to particular kinds of content. There may be issues around whether or not any of the content was piratical. There may be issues around any number of things. But the thing is that these are issues that are uniquely poorly situated to have a legislature deal with them because they're fact specific. And that's how the courts resolve these things, one case at a time.
Oh,
which is, and that's where our members are. So even though they disagree about these things and they think in some circumstances the law ought to play, one group will say, well, in this circumstance, the law ought to apply in a particular way versus a different circumstance. That kind of salami slicing is what needs to happen before there can really be any policy solution.
Talking all things information life cycle, responsible information management. We're talking to Chris Mohr of the Software and Information and Industry Association, right? Did I get that right?
Close enough. It doesn't really roll off the tongue, does it?
Industry.
I got to work on that.
So the SIIA, dialing in from our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. And you mentioned in the last segment, piratical, meaning pirated. And so if someone has trained their model on pirated software, pirated movies, for example, that's a whole separate area that needs to be handled differently from a policy perspective, right? Do you want to talk about that for a second?
Sure. I mean, I think I'm talking about, when I talk about that, what I'm talking about is in the context of a copyright lawsuit, which is where all this is now, there is there's a defense called fair use, which is kind of copyrights, if you like, copyright's golden rule. It's not do unto others and run. It's do unto others as you would have them do,
right?
Do to you. And it's designed to be a rule of reason, right?
Right.
And so, but it's one that's based in equity or fairness. And so your risk looks different if you had lawfully acquired a bunch of stuff, a bunch of legitimate copies, if you legitimately got access to legitimate copies and used them versus you got access to illegitimate copies, infringing copies, and used those, the fairness balance looks different. It's the risk analysis is simply different. You know, and that's saying it without opining on how the case may turn out.
Right.
Because there's lots of other facts that could swing it one way or the other, but the risk looks different.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. And so what we're trying to do is to find reasonable policies. And I know all about fair use. It basically says, look, I mean, you can read something and remember it. And then if you happen to quote it and you didn't realize you're quoting it verbatim, well, you're not doing something bad. You're just reflecting back. And what's interesting is that's really kind of what these AI models are doing, the large language models. You know, the big aha moment for me was understanding that when you train one of these models on information, it's not actually persisting the verbatim text. Rather, it is adjusting, the engine adjusts its own weights and biases in its parameters, which is kind of like how humans learn. I mean, these are neural nets that were designed to attempt to reflect how human beings behave. But the point is, it's not like copying and then pasting later on. It's absorbing this information, adjusting its parameters accordingly, and there are billions of parameters in some of these models. And then it's reflecting back to you text based upon your prompt, and it's a predictive engine. Basically, it's a predictive engine that gives you what it thinks you're looking for based upon your prompt, which is a very different thing from just copying text and then pasting it under a different name, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, I had a similar insight for me was that these engines are essentially a particular kind of artist, which I wouldn't describe on a family show. What I mean by that is they say, act as if you were.
Hmm.
So if you ask them a question and say, I would like the answer to this, to a particular question, can you explain the fair use defense to me? You are saying, act as if you are an expert on fair use. What would you tell this person?
Right.
And then the quality of the data will determine that answer, right? It could be right, it could be wrong. And when you get into more sensitive questions around security, around, for example, I don't know, creating chemical weapons and stuff like that, it requires a lot of thought and care to make sure that the engine doesn't do what it's supposed to, so to speak.
Right. Well, and of course, there's dual use technologies. That's a very common thing to
Sure.
watch out for in the government, because you can use the stuff for fertilizer or to make a bomb, right?
Right.
And so you have to be able to understand the difference between the two. And you're right that this comes into question where rubber meets road when there's a lawsuit somewhere, and then you have to hash out all the different issues and try to understand. But I think you're on target to say that the fair use doctrine is meant to be fair, as the name would indicate. It's meant to say, all right, there are lines we can draw about how you can responsibly use these things. And I understand it, in the music industry, there's some pretty precise rules around that, like how many notes in a row can be the same and things of this nature when push comes to shove in a court of law somewhere. But just generally speaking, it's very interesting to me to see how these large language models have triggered all these conversations around ethics and ethical AI and what you can do. And I think the answer to most of that is solved in two different ways. One is data governance, and the other is transparency. And the transparency argument, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, because of course you got Llama 2 and Llama 3 from Meta, which are open source. OpenAI used to be open source. It's not now. It's now a black box. And what do you think, from your perspective, how big a difference is that? How does that change things when it's a black box versus an open source model?
So that is, I'm going to give you an answer that's accurate and both technically accurate and practically useless. And the answer is that it depends.
Right.
I think, because we have seen these debates before. And by that, I mean, there was a time when those who made, and I'll put it in scare quotes, black box software were scared to death of open source,
right?
Viewed it as a virus, one that needed, a proportionate response.
Right.
And it turned out to be a really good way of developing secure and interoperable systems in certain circumstances. There are times when you will want that. There are times when you won't. I think here we are seeing, to some degree, a similar kind of we're seeing a similar drama play out. I think it is a little different around the edges, but there it really has to go. The way that it's different is that the engines themselves are so flexible. And so in other words, if you're building, I don't know, an open source video rendering tool, just looking at this screen, that's what it is. Whereas an open source AI model is different. So what is the right approach to that? The right approach to dealing with something like that is going to be based on risk. In other words, you have to be sure that and this is the way that the U.S. is progressing, this is the way the White House has made clear that it wants to go. They want a risk-based approach to this. But to give you a really simple answer, and in our experience, I mean, we've been around for, we're creeping on 50, which is a long time for a quote technology, close quote, association. So, we've seen a few rodeos, and in our experience anyway, technology neutral regulation tends to be the best way to approach these things. In other words, you don't look so much, you look at the risks that the technology creates. So fraud is still going to be fraud. It doesn't matter. If it's a scammer calling you in real life, or if it's a bot scammer using AI to create a voice, they're both okay. Both of those things are scary. They are both. It's a dual use technology, right? People will use it in movies, for example, to create a character that no longer exists, or an actor's voice that can no longer use his.
Right.
Right. That's dual use technology, but it's still fraud.
Right.
And there are remedies for that. And if there are technology specific angles, that's what we need to look into, as opposed to saying, okay, and this is typical of the EU, sort of where they started was, it's not coming out unless we approve it.
Right.
And that's which treats, your Spotify algorithm the same way that it would treat, power grid management.
Mm-hmm.
That's just not, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and you're reminding me of something too, because deep fakes are definitely an issue. Certainly, we're going to see this in the political sphere. I mean, I've seen a couple that were very funny. I'm not going to lie. I won't say which one it was or who it was, but it was like, what? What did she say? I had to laugh, but okay, it's a deep fake. That's what's happening here. But I think that probably, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, there are some very practical ways you can leverage technology to know if something is genuine, because most cameras are digital cameras these days, and they have a whole host of metadata that's baked into that device about what device it is, what time this thing was taken, what the location was. A lot of them have geolocation. So if you pass all those markers, then that looks good. Then you could say this photograph was of the wreckage from a tornado in Kansas, and it checks out. Yep, it was in Kansas. Yep, it was this date. Okay, that looks pretty good. And you're starting to see, I think it was Meta and someone else say, maybe it was Google, they're going to try to create some watermarks on digitally altered photography, videos, things of this nature. Also, I think that's a very practical way to go, because then you'll be able to sense that, or your browser can sense that. It'll say, and you can turn it on or off. Like, is this real or is this generated? I think that's some pretty good stuff. Even when someone calls you on the phone, is it a real voice? I mean, I get calls, and I know the technology underneath, so I'm curious to see, and like, they'll wait a second. Oh, how are you doing? Anyway, this is Jane from such and such. I'm like, okay, sure it is. Like, this is a computer voice talking to you. But what do you think about all that, about the practical ways we can leverage technology and existing formats and protocols to kind of shepherd ourselves towards getting to the truth?
So there's one of the ideas, I tend to be optimistic about the role of technology in this space. In other words, we will deploy things, and then there will always be some kind of unintended consequence, right? One way or another. And then we figure out a way to fix it. So in this particular space, content provenance, what you were talking about, that's exactly the kind of thing that can greatly ameliorate the harm from deepfakes, because you'll know where the image came from and whether or not it altered.
That's right.
That's that kind of thing. It takes time. Standards doesn't take long to lie. Right?
Good quote.
But it does take time to develop standards for figuring out what the truth is, particularly when you have a variety of companies with a variety of different kinds of IP getting together and trying to figure out something that's going to work for everybody. That's how the standards process works, and it's an incredibly valuable one, but it takes time.